All right, now we're going to focus on uranium. We didn't talk about uranium in the previous panel. Let's start off with Section 232. And Mark, if you can kind of quickly in a minute tell us what it is, what should an investor speculate, and what's the time frame of the catalyst?
Okay. 232, I think you got to start off with the fundamentals that the United States is the largest consumer of uranium, about 50 million pounds for power generation. But when you add the demand for the nuclear navy, which is classified information, the United States consumes about 1/3 of the world's uranium. 1/3. And we only produce 1 or 2% of our requirements. That should shock people. It should shock people.
And why doesn't it? I've been writing about it for years.
I think that over time, the United States used to have a national policy that supported the nuclear fuel cycle, and it no longer does. Russia has one. China has one. That's not going away. They're going to continue to produce no matter what the prices are. And they can gain geopolitical influence because of that. So, really the basis of Section 232 is that uranium production in the nuclear fuel cycle deteriorating to where it has is a national security issue for the United States. And I think that plays really well with the U.S. government for the right reasons. And particularly what we've seen in the past, year or two with the growing influence of those areas.
What's the time frame of these catalysts?
Well, the petition was submitted in January. It was initiated in July 18th. The Commerce has a time clock, statutory time clock, that they have to render a report on what their findings are by mid-April of 2019. So it's time's clicking by, and then the president has up to 90 days after that to make a decision. Now, the decision could be that, no, we don't need a nuclear fuel cycle. We can let it all go. We'll get it from Russia. But we don't think that's going to be the case, but, we'll see how it all plays out. But we think the argument, the petition, is so strong that the average American and the government is going to say, bullshit. We need to have a nuclear fuel cycle that is not completely dependent on our foes.
So Amir, with all the, not lobbying, but your long experience in the U.S. production and development of uranium assets, have you seen the shift happen politically and from an investment standpoint of not just the politicians, but even the NGOs when it comes to the uranium sector in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think, those of you that live here in California, you're probably familiar with Mike Schellenberger, who was running as a candidate for the governor of the state. He's a very pro-nuclear guy who's done phenomenal work in terms of educating and talking about the importance of reducing our carbon footprint in the U.S. and in the world by having nuclear power in the mix. I think just the other day you saw a number of environmental scientists write an open letter to the leaders of the G20 nations advocating for stronger support and inclusion of nuclear power in policy and policy development in those countries. I think for the first time ever, we're seeing a very important linkage between millennials, environmentalists, and the green movement and nuclear power. I think this had a lot to do with maybe some important shifts in the Senate as well. Harry Reid, who was a Senate Majority Leader, a Democrat from Nevada, was a staunch nuclear power opponent. With his retirement from the Senate, I think for the first time, the supporting nuclear power is becoming more of a bipartisan issue. And I think for the first time, we're seeing people in place that really recognize the importance of nuclear power in charge of important branches of government. You look at Department of Energy and Rick Perry, who's the former governor of the state of Texas. I know him personally very well because for the 14 years that we've been a company operating out of South Texas, he was the governor of that state, longest serving governor of the state of Texas. And I can tell you, he's done amazing work over the last 2 years in raising the profile of nuclear power. When the Saudis announced that they wanted to build 16 nuclear power plants, he jumped on a plane and went over there and said, hey, we got to get American technology that you guys buy and install here. This is the influence that Mark was talking about. America's ability to influence diplomatic relations positively through exporting nuclear technology has almost disappeared. 70% of nuclear reactors under construction in the world today are either Chinese or Russian design and technology. Westinghouse is just emerging out of a bankruptcy and plan a reorganization there. And you need to have kind of a longer term view to say, not only could this be a great source of power generation domestically, but this could be a wonderful export technology and a way to really forge diplomatic relations for decades to come. And that's what the Chinese and the Russians are doing.
What's interesting, in my book, I talked about what the Russians are doing, and not only do they fund the nuclear reactor, they'll build it for you, and they'll provide the life cycle of uranium for you. So they vertically integrate all aspects from the government level. So that Perry was the first time in my career I've seen a government official actually try to get the American companies involved in that. Now, I've been to both your projects, Lost Creek and all of Amir's projects at UEC from Hobson and around Palangana. And when you walk around these projects, it does not look like a mine. You know, it looks like a water facility, essentially. And I've been to White Mesa Mill. These are small footprints, but yet how do we change the sentiment in the market about nuclear, not in my backyard and all that? How do we go about doing that?
Yeah, look,
can we change it?
Yeah, look, it's always been an issue. Every time you have, one of these black swan events, and I hate the word, it scares people. And I think that people, it's easy for them not to understand, and a lot of people don't understand that nuclear power is like the safest energy out there. It's proven. The only real incidents of a nuclear power accident was Chernobyl. Fukushima really just proved one thing, that it is dangerous to live next to the ocean. It's dangerous to live next to the ocean because of tsunamis. So, it's always going to be a challenge because people associate it with a bomb.
And the media didn't pick up about how the other nuclear reactors were a safe haven for the people in the town to protect them.
Yeah, it's something that we have to continue to work on, and I agree with Amir that a lot of it starts at the government level. If the government doesn't support what you're doing or support a nuclear industry, you're in trouble. You have to have national support. And that's what we've lost over the last few years, but we are seeing signs of it coming back, and this new administration is providing support. Love it or hate it, it is providing support in resources and in energy and baseload energy in particular. So I think that, and Amir's right, we have to have nuclear power. If you are serious about climate change, believe it or not, but nuclear power is clean energy.
So Amir, what does it take? A guy like Bill Gates to tweet and be super bullish on nuclear energy? What changes the sentiment out there?
Honestly, and maybe we should save ourselves a lot of breath and time for the audience here. I just encourage you, speaking of Bill, whether it's Bill Gates tweeting or whatnot, please just take 5 minutes, okay? I just tweeted it this morning, the link to this article about the environmental scientists and the letter that they wrote to the G20 leaders. It has 7 bullet points right out in the front page of the letter that discusses the case for nuclear power. It's so succinct. It's not by a bunch of nuclear power company executives. It's by environmental scientists who have come to this conclusion. Just read that. And I think you spend 5 minutes reading that, and that message gets out more. And on top of the fact that everyone should know here, Bill Gates is a huge proponent of nuclear power. He's investing heavily in small modular reactors, SMR technology. Guys like Peter Thiel, big
George
nuclear
Soros.
Power. Yeah, I mean, again, this is, I think it's almost a radical change that I'm witnessing for the first time in a long time. It is happening.
So let's get now into the investment perspective. That's why people are here. So Amir, let's go back to what it would cost to build your plant, let's say Hobson and all of the facilities, what other companies have invested in the time to build it just all in versus what you paid for it and what an investor can pay today in your company.
I think the big issues, first of all, at our luncheon presentation today at 12 p.m., we're going to get into a lot of the details like this. I think on a panel like this, maybe I'll highlight what is really in my opinion, Mark can speak to it as well, in my opinion, the barrier to entry, the highest cost item in U.S. uranium mining is permitting. Permitting timelines have been ridiculously long. From our own personal experience directly with uranium energy, in business-friendly, mining-friendly Texas, it took us 4 to 5 years to permit uranium mines. In Wyoming, before it became an agreement state, the Reno Creek project took 7 years to get permitted. These are in places where there's existing uranium mining. Forget about states where there's no uranium mining and you're trying to do it for the first time in a long time. And so I think the issue really here is that permitting is a barrier to entry. Permitting really is a rate determining step when it comes to getting projects up and running. Luckily, there's a few of us in the country that have fully permitted assets in place ready to go. And I think longer term, what I am really excited about, and this is the thing that Marin I wanted to really raise on this panel, is the fact that the U.S. as a jurisdiction has seen very little exploration for uranium in the last 15 or 20 years. Most of the projects that we have and other companies have were from the last cycle in the 1970s and 1980s. Look at all the new exploration discoveries that have led to hundreds of millions of pounds being discovered in Western Athabasca Basin in the last 10 years, where no one ever thought historically there was going to be any uranium there. Yet with new technology, with new innovations in exploration, new tools that are available. The last time there was a real rush in exploration for uranium in the US, none of the tools that have been developed over the last decade were being utilized. And so I'm bullish about the exploration upside and prospects in the US. No one's really attempted to do large-scale exploration in that country. And that combined with keeping in mind that permitting timelines are very challenging, and hopefully we get some changes at the EPA that can just make them more reasonable. No one's asking for a walk through the park, but just to have a more reasonable timeline for permitting.
Well, this brings me to my question, Mark. I was at White Mesa when they were laying the liner for the tailings back in 2005, 2006, and it was like $5 million. And you look at what an investor today can buy the company and the infrastructure at a massive discount of what was built in the past. You just sit back and you're like, this is value investing in the resource sector, which rarely ever happens.
Yeah, no, look at the money spent over the course, and not just for us, but look at like Cigar Lake. You know, nobody wants to add up what it costs to build and produce in Cigar Lake.
Budget.
But yeah, something like White Mesa, and look at what Amir says, the permitting timeline's 5 to 10 years, maybe more. But you know, there's huge value investing. You know, when you look at the value of the assets of the companies, the really positioned companies that are permitted and have facilities built, if you add up the value of that hardware, it's huge. And the thing that people don't understand is that the going forward true value of a pound of uranium is at least $60. At least $60. That's what it's worth. If you buy a pound of uranium for $27 today or whatever, that is not fair value. And so we have to get back to those kind of prices to even have an industry. And that includes Cameco. You know, Tim Gitzel said that he is not going to produce a pound for less than $50 under contract. So, you know, these utilities and...
It's good to finally see that because, you know, 4 years ago I debated him on the underfeeding impact that the Russians are doing because the SWU costs are so low. And he said, no, it's not a big deal. Boy, was it a big deal because the Russians are just puking out this stuff. And because their currency's decreasing, they can stay competitive versus the Americans. So a question I have for you guys is, there's so few permitted facilities. Even if you're running at full throttle, we're talking about negligent increase on the amount of the American dependency on foreign imports. So what do the American infrastructure, the permitting need to do to get away? Because if this was oil, the country would revolt if it was the same situation, how much we depend on foreign imports, especially former Soviet states.
Just maybe I can jump into that because I actually think there's an interesting parallel with oil. We had the chairman of our company is Spencer Abraham, who's the former United States Energy Secretary. And when he became Energy Secretary, the U.S. at the time had not developed a national energy plan in over a decade. Spence, along with George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, put together at the time the first national energy plan, which really kind of laid the foundation to what ultimately became the shale revolution in the U.S. When he was energy secretary, the U.S. was importing 50% of its oil requirements. When they walked in, they thought, this is a national disaster. 50% of our requirements are being imported. By the way, don't forget, 98% of U.S. requirements for uranium are right now not mined on U.S. soil. So the situation is so much more severe compared to oil. But in the case of oil, when you combined the right policy, right technical innovation, financial ingenuity, the American innovation and mindset, look at what it's done. Who would have ever thought at that time in 2005 that the U.S. would be at par or competing against Saudi Arabia when it comes to oil production? And I actually think in the case of uranium, today we keep talking about how Kazakhstan is the world's largest uranium producer. They're the equivalents of Saudi Arabia, but so much more in terms of market share. I bet you in 5 years from now, in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see so much production growth in the U.S. that in terms of uranium, that could seriously challenge Kazakhstan's throne and domination of the sector. I see incredible parallels with oil. And the biggest reason for that is this. Kazakhstan has become the king of the castle in global uranium mining, using a technology called in-situ recovery that was invented in places like Wyoming and Texas 35, 40 years ago. We've got the best handle on that technology in this country. It's a very environmentally friendly technology. It's a very low-cost way of mining uranium. And that's ultimately, I think, where this can turn around and be such an important growth industry. And the parallels to oil are incredible.
You make a good point there. In 20 years, Kazakhstan went from less than 1 million barrels of 1 million pounds a year of uranium production to over 60 in 20 years. That's a blip on a cycle. What about, if either of you have a question, all the bombs, all the nuclear warheads? Why can't we downblend 20 or 30% of these nuclear warheads?
Well, they have been downblended. A lot of them have been downblended. You know, the uranium inventories are all different forms and shapes and whatnot. You know, and the cost and expense to enrich up, it's also costly to de-enrich down. So look, it's a funky space, uranium, you know, and it's a funky space for investors. People see the high rides and the big crashes that we've seen mainly after Fukushima, and even in the past. If you go back through the cycles of uranium over the last 50 years, I mean, there's been big money made and big money lost, but no, there's plenty of uranium out there. It's really the pricing, and you know, going back on this concept of the prices. And something like Tim Gitzel saying we need $50 going forward or we're not going to start up our mines, again, add the costs they've spent in those mines up until that point in time. This is going forward costs, you know. So what is Cameco needed, $70, $80 or something? I was charge of operations for Paladin Energy for 5 years, and I ran Langer Heinrich and Kayla Cara. And I can tell you that, you know, when you take those projects, and Langer Heinrich was one of the best projects out there in the world, the biggest success stories outside of Kazakhstan. But when I added up the fully loaded costs, you're talking about capital and operating costs, it was about $60, $65 a pound. And that's the reality, the best projects out there. So if you go back to this fundamental belief that the price has to be $60, $65 a pound to make to have a profitable, sustainable industry, then you should invest in uranium, because this $20, $25, $30 a pound uranium is not going to last forever.
So I was throwing you guys a softball with the question about the nuclear warheads. Clearly you're not reading my free publications. The point was this. The reason why the HEU agreement, when Bill Clinton signed it with Boris Yeltsin in 1992 in Vancouver, British Columbia, the Russians, the Soviets, had the infrastructure in place to downblend. So as you know, the Americans do not have that current capacity to do so the same. They would have to export it to either Britain or Germany or the Russians, who have half of the world's capacity. I just don't think the American population would feel good about sending their warheads to the Russians to get downblended material. I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, I don't. It goes back to what I said earlier. I just don't think America is ready to throw the keys to the whole nuclear fuel cycle to the Russians or the Chinese. And I think that bodes well with the petition. We didn't build our company around the petition. We do have vanadium. We're one of the few that, well, the only one that has a vanadium plant. But we're building our company based on the fundamentals of the world uranium market. We think that the 232 provides a inflection point potentially to get uprate the price of uranium for U.S. uranium production, because when you look at the current prices and you look at the fact that Cameco shut down McArthur River, and half the uranium production was reduced this year in Canada. If prices stay where they are today, that cheap uranium, there will be no uranium production in Canada in 3-4 years.
I have a question for you. Ron Hochstein, who's the key president who built up White Mesa, a very close friend of mine, and I was there when they were building the vanadium circuit. Why wouldn't you lock in or hedge or stream the vanadium production to prices at today? Because we've gone from $4 to $30 in 2.5 years.
Well, if we could, we would. We've tried. People are kind of afraid of the vanadium market because of the peaks and the valleys.
So would the suppliers give you $25?
Yeah, well,
or 20?
Look at
what's the real price?
We've tried over the last several months with these higher prices, and we've gotten sort of close. But people on those streaming agreements wanted such big discounts, that it just didn't make sense. We decided to go open on the market and go spot. We'll be producing vanadium in about 2 or 3 weeks, fairly large quantities of vanadium. And
so your 2019 pounds guidance for vanadium?
Well, we haven't actually given guidance on it yet because we actually want to restart the plant because we're recycling some of the vanadium out of our tailings facility, and we want to run for a couple months before we give guidance. But we publicly said we're looking at our first phase of around 4 million pounds of vanadium recovered. That's our goal. Current vanadium price is $25 a pound. That's a substantial amount of money for a company like ours when vanadium isn't our primary business. Uranium is our primary business. Nice secondary business, guys.
Yep. So, Amir, let's fast forward to now 2020. We've seen the HEU agreement come and go, and the price of uranium went lower. What are some catalysts that the people in the audience should write down, whether it's more Japanese restarts, the growth in China or Saudi Arabia, the UAE? What are some tangible catalysts that people should write down and go, on this date, this should happen, therefore the price should respond, in your mind?
Well, what's interesting about that is we can walk through those catalysts, and common sense will tell us the price should respond. But at the same time, sometimes that doesn't perfectly correlate. So that's my little disclaimer. But what are the key catalysts that we can expect for the sector, in my opinion? First of all, put it back to Cameco. Remember, Cameco shut down McArthur River. Cameco has announced that McArthur River stays down indefinitely. They need to deliver into sales contracts that they have from prior years. So, in balance of this year, the idea was that they would be buying 2 to 4 million pounds of uranium to deliver into contracts. And next year, 9 to 11 million pounds of uranium that they need to purchase from the spot market for their contract deliveries. Cameco has not only shut down the supply source, which is a positive, but has become a buyer as well as a result of contracts. So look for Cameco to continue to be in the market. Just last week, they came out with a tender looking for 500,000 pounds of uranium. Next point is, in the coming sort of 6 months, look for catalysts around the Section 232 investigation. The farthest date it can happen is April of next year. Maybe there'll be some news around it even in advance of that. Certainly after the midterm, I don't think anyone suspects things to happen leading up to the midterm because everyone's distracted. Japanese reactor restarts are slow and steady. I expect them to continue. I don't honestly expect them to add to velocity of the uranium price recovery. The other major event, which is a never seen before in the uranium sector, is the IPO for Kazatomprom. Again, this is no different than when Saudi Aramco announced that plans to go public. And even though it hasn't happened, it became a positive event for the firming up of the oil price. And so we have a similar situation going on with Kazatomprom. Again, the world's largest uranium mining company, 40% of global supply. They have filed their information document with the London Stock Exchange looking for a London IPO. Their management is expected to be on the road this week doing test the water meetings with institutional investors to see what kind of appetite they get. Now in that country, if you tell Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, that you're going to get something done, you got to get it done. And there's articles that says they told him they'll be public before the end of this year. So either they'll be public or maybe they'll announce an extension. I'm not sure. But the point is, I think for the first time, we have all of our interest is aligned with the world's biggest supplier. What do I mean by that? Kazatomprom has, in a very, almost, in a way that didn't make sense, right? Since Fukushima happened, the uranium price has gone this way. Kazatomprom's production has gone that way. So clearly, all these years, despite the falling uranium price, Kazatomprom was very focused on volume and increasing market share. Now, with the transition into becoming a public company, Credit Suisse, JP Morgan are the underwriters, and they clearly understand a stronger market cap and IPO debut has to be underpinned by a stronger uranium price. So their focus now goes from volume to value, from top line to bottom line. And I think that's a really positive thing for uranium investors because, guys, all these years, we were almost competing with a state-run company that, again, didn't necessarily think or care much about profitability. And just like Cameco now
and
does.
And competing with their currency. You produce in US dollars, they produce in the tenge, which was slaughtered 60, 70%.
Huge advantage that they had with that tenge. And at the end of the day, I think we have to remember that the method of uranium mining there, the in-situ recovery method, it's targeting low-grade deposits using the same method that we're talking about here, meaning there isn't some significant grade advantage. It's the sheer function of size and ability that they had as a government-run company to permit and build and crank things up quickly, had the currency devaluation. I think a lot of those key things now normalize as they go public. And I think going into 2019, with all the supply cuts, don't forget this, 2016, uranium production worldwide peaked at 162 million pounds. This year is expected to be 135 million pounds. These supply cuts are real. And if they don't rebalance the market in the next 6 months, they certainly will in the next 12 months because it really is about that supply-demand fundamental and the supply deficit that we're going to have.
Okay, the last few minutes I want to open up to the floor. It's great when I see some really great minds in the audience that I've known for a long time. I'm going to ask someone in the audience a question. Mr. Paul Stevens, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so the technology that we're talking about for mining uranium is the in-situ recovery, also known as in-situ leaching, also known as solution mining. All those things mean the same thing. And it's quite unique to certain commodities, be it uranium, potash, there's a little bit of it with copper. And it's basically targeting uranium. So it's not so much just the technology, but it's a combination of the technology and certain geology, certain deposits that are sandstone hosted, have certain confining characteristics, and they could be mined using solution where you're dissolving the uranium as opposed to conventional mining where it's a strip mining situation and earth moving exercise.
But I think you're probably referring to what Areva's developing, the Sabre technologies. Is that what you're referring to?
Okay.
Yeah, so Sabre technologies is very different than, not very different than ISR, but it's for different type of deposits. Yeah. It's still very early days in Sabre. Sabre will be applied to the Athabasca deposits, less than 300 meters, maybe 350 when they get going, but it's very interesting.
Just a quick comment too on the production out of Kazakhstan, Russia. The production out of Kazakhstan ISR is acid leach too. It's not carbonate leach. So, and you have to have some unique circumstances to allow to have formations, as Amir said, that are appropriate for the conditions that do not have too high of acid consumption, or your economics get truncated. So, not all the deposits in the U.S., but acid. If you can use acid leaching in the right environment, you have better kinetics and a lot of times have better costs. So there are some abilities to do things in these other countries that you can't do in the U.S.
Yes, sir, there. We got last question because I got a young millennial that's going to come out and change our way of trading. Yes, sir. David. Yep.
geez, I don't know about the uranium side of it, but look, I think for our company, the fact that we have uranium and we have vanadium is a beautiful combination. You know, it's energy. You got the green energy element to it. You got the nuclear power, which is green energy. You know, and so I don't know. I mean, but one of the issues with the vanadium flow battery is that if vanadium prices are too high, the cost of the battery becomes too high. So you got to kind of strike the balance.
Interestingly enough, when that vanadium circuit was built, it wasn't for the batteries. It was
No.
for steel application. And it was hilarious.
And I
It was
have to
based
correct
on
you.
$8 vanadium.
The vanadium circuit wasn't built when Ron Hochstein got there. It was being refurbished. It was built in 1979. So. But yeah, no, whether it's lithium, any of these battery metals, you got to be careful. If price goes too high and the economics change.
And then there'll be substitute metals and competing metals, kind of like the light rare earths. So they're all
the biggest driver of the vanadium market right now is the rebar in China. They've changed the rebar standards. They go in the 1st of November, and now they're having to use vanadium to get the tensile strength, and it's very hard to substitute.
Okay, so Amir, your lunch is at
12 p.m. Downstairs in what is called the meal room. If you're interested to attend, you got to come by our booth and get a sticker. There's limited seating.
Is it vegan friendly?
We'll make sure it is for you.
And what booth are you at?
And we're at booth 200.
Mark, what booth are you at?
111.
I like that number.
It's like you.
All right, guys. Make sure you go see them. Thanks very much.
Thank you.